to be honest, I don't deal with racism on my everyday basis.
Right.
You know,
people
like,
don't say nasty things to you
no,
because of the color of your skin.
correct. I mean, I live in California. People are very conscious here. And I work from home, so I'm not out in the world all the time dealing with racism. But what I know is that it affects me deeper than anything, because it affects where I'm going to live. It affects housing. It affects so many things, and I've become so passionate about the wealth gap in the country, and it breaks my heart to know that the disparity in the wealth gap. I'm reading a book called The Color of Money, and it's infuriating, like, when I read those kind of books about, how, and also, like, in business, like, it's really hard for me to get funding. And it's hard for me to get funding even from my own family. And I know, like, I'm not special because we don't have wealth. And I think what also makes me so angry, it's like, it's not just blacks in America that don't have the wealth. It's also blacks in Africa, where, like, the poorest continent with so many resources. And it just, and it sometimes make me depressed, like last week.
Yeah, I think you kind of like hit the nail on the head. It's the stuff that actually has a much bigger impact, So I was thinking, when I thought back, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhoods and predominantly white areas. And so to me, racism was like the stuff that I see on TV or whatever at like Trump rallies. That to me was racism. Racism was using the N-word. Racism was that movie with Edward Norton. I forget what it was called, but the one where he's like a white supremacist. Like, that to me was racism. I think, and then you also see, right now I see a lot of white people who sort of defend themselves, or it's not all white people, or black people have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or this kind of stuff, or like, I'm not racist, basically meaning I don't call black people the N-word. And I don't see a black person and think like I want to go lynch them or whatever. Like, that is what we've come to think as what is not race, or not we, but I think there are a lot of white people who will look and say that's what racism is, and that's not me.
Correct. And I feel like for me, I don't look, that is racism, but I think racism goes even deeper when you look from it from an academic point of view. It's the system that keeps oppressing Black people. Right. It's not so much the everyday doing, and that hurts, but it's the system that keeps us in like this perpetual cycle of inequality and poverty. That to me is like what has been really making me so depressed.
Let's talk about a specific example. So last week, a black man was shot 7 times in the back while his children were watching. Okay, that happened. And so that kind of hit you, right? But then something else happened, which is this article that was published in the New York Times about how some of it might be conscious, but almost an unconscious bias in housing. Correct. And so this article did a study into home values of African Americans. And it's now being studied and documented that and we can see this because there have been times where there's like a mixed race family like you and me, where what's been happening is an appraiser will come and will appraise the house way below value when the African American spouse happens to be home. But if they switch that around, or in the same house, what they'll do is they'll basically take any sort of proof down that there's a black family living there and replace it with like family pictures of the white person's family. And regularly, the value of that home is 40% greater than when it's as though it's an African American. Now, that you can look at, say, appraisers who do that, and those people would say, I'm not racist, because it's something that is so underneath the surface that they can't even recognize it. When you say I'm not racist, then you're also actually not examining areas in which you have unconscious biases that you have no even idea that you have. This is so common with sort of human thinking. And then last week, one of the things that happened is that, the stuff was happening with Jacob Blake, and then reading that article. And when you look at this and you see somebody's house was a $200,000 difference in one of the key studies. $200,000, right? It went from $250,000 to $450,000, right? Now, the difference, let's say somebody has a mortgage or whatever, the difference in that is whether or not their kids can afford to go to college or not. And so it's this continuous pushing. And that, I think, was just one of those things that really hit home. And then there was, and then you're reading The Color of Money. And I felt like there was one other thing, and it was just sort of hammering into you kind of this like, wow, like, what about catching a break?
I know. That article was like, the stuff with Jacob Blake was like happening, and it's painful. But then on top of that, to read that article and know that if we were ever to buy a home, and also it's because it was like an interracial couple, that if we were to buy a home and I was home, that my house would be devalued. So I was just like, wait, so now if I were to sell a home, you'd have to be there to sell a home?
Right.
And then I was like thinking like, okay, good for me. I have a white man as a husband. Like, what's happening to all the Black people that don't have white men in their lives?
or a woman, yeah.
Yeah,